Good morning, everyone. I'd first like to thank Alberto and the entire NCBA team for putting on a world-class cybersecurity event. I'm proud to be a part of it. And in particular, what I like is the linkage between Europe and America and North and South America. Allison's presentation is going to lead into some of the things I'm going to talk about today. And I come from the George C. Marshall Center, which is a German-American partnership, and I lead the cybersecurity program there. And what we do is some of the worldwide capacity building activities that I'm going to talk about today, and that you all have a role in helping develop a safe and secure internet. So over the last day, we've talked about some of the key challenges in cybersecurity. In developing countries, they're no different. But I'd like to call your attention to a few of the items that are worthwhile of special mention and action by all of us. The first one is developing national strategies and policies. If you don't have a roadmap of where you want to go to have a safer and secure cyberspace, you'll never get there. And certainly what's important is that the ever-increasing interconnectedness of people and machines requires us to take action. There are multiple human resource challenges, financial challenges, but nonetheless there are strategy and policy, action, and activities that we can do to make this internet more safe and secure. So why does this matter to you? Cybersecurity, as you know, is an unclear concept. When talking to senior leaders in private industry, in government, talking to your parents, it's still an unclear concept of what it is and what it's not. We're challenged by multiple different terms, lexicon, and language done by different organizations, different governments. So sometimes just saying what is cybersecurity and what it's not can be a big challenge, let alone the technical aspects of what types of attacks are happening, how they're being conducted. It's a growing space with rapid expansion, and I'm going to give you some highlights and examples of what's happening in Africa, but the numbers in Africa are indicative of the growth and expansion happening globally. Let's go back one. In addition, cybersecurity objectives by governments and international organizations are vastly different. And these have to be taken into account. We heard yesterday from Camino Kavanaugh talking about some of the friction within the UN group of government experts. One thing is clear is that individuals, countries, and organizations are still talking about these challenges, and that's good. You know, what we need to do as cybersecurity professionals, all of us, is to take an active role to address some of these challenges, using your role in different form and organizations to say, well, there may be friction, but what can we do to achieve results instead of admiring the problems that are there? It's a rapidly escalating environment. We heard yesterday through our police panel that the challenges of addressing cyber criminals, cyber gangs is becoming even more and more important. And I'll talk about some of these threats and challenges in a few moments. Common standards, securities, and protocols cause additional friction. And we'll talk about what not only the EU is doing a little bit later in the presentation, but also what other big countries are doing. And as you can imagine, some of these efforts aren't synchronized and some are not. So in the developing world, who do they look to? Who does the developing world, each nation, those international organizations, those regional organizations look to say, we want to aspire to follow the EU standards. We want to follow the American standards. We want to follow the Japanese. We want to follow the ITU. This is an enormous challenge for governments, and your partners, whether it's in private industry or in government in the developing world, have to address these challenges. So what I like to say is fundamental cybersecurity challenges. There are plenty of technical ones, there are plenty of political ones, but the biggest ones, they're people problems. And you have a role to help solve these problems. So I talked to you a few minutes ago just what some of the highlights from Africa. These results are from January of this year. I'd like you to focus on the bottom percentages. 41% urbanized in Africa, 29% internet penetration out of all users in Africa. Mobile subscriptions, 81%, so most people using phones. So annual growth, I think this is something to look at. The continent of Africa is a very youthful place, so explosive growth is going to happen, and governments are trying to address many developmental issues. So how does cybersecurity raise itself to a level of importance where governments will take action, private industries will take action? Well, I'll suggest to you that it's not just a developing problem close in and around Europe, it's a global problem. And I call your attention to the numbers on the right circled in red. This is annual growth numbers. And this explosive growth with a greater proliferation of devices, whether they're computers, smartphones, the Internet of Things, device explosive growth is going to require literally global solutions. And we have to work together to try to develop a better understanding of how we are going to do that. What do those challenges look like, and how are they amplified in the developing world? So I've called out 5 particular areas. You know, is national security and information different in most countries? Certainly it is. In some countries it might be related to their Ministry of Defense, in others it might be with natural resources. The misuse of personal information. We've talked about that a little bit yesterday in the panels. How could personal information in the developing world be misused? Well, many ways. And then finally, exploitation of governance information, and I'll finish with attack of control systems and why this is important. Because the control systems lead to citizens being affected, and citizens will demand greater action by better quality products provided by private industry and government responses, whole of government approaches. So who's doing that attacking? Well, in this audience, no one will be surprised. It's everything from insider threats all the way to machines and advanced machines and AI potentially conducting these attacks repeatedly, consistently all over the world. But the greatest challenge that in the developing world has is weak national security institutions and cultures to address dynamic challenges to threats and risks and in an ever-changing environment. I'd ask you to think about how do, in the developing world, the rule of law, combating corruption, those are enormous challenges just today. And when we put a blanket of increased cybersecurity balanced with many of the other developmental things that are required in the developing world. Education, food safety, health and environmental issues, you know, does cybersecurity raise itself to the top? Certainly not. But it has to be incorporated in everything we do in terms of developmental assistance and capacity building. And it's an area where everyone in this room can have a role to make things better. And I'll talk about that. So not only the who, but the types of attacks. Well, as cybersecurity professionals, I mean, I put a few up here to just sort of highlight the types of attacks. But the types of attacks are persistent and repetitive. An attack that works good in Antarctica will work good in the Arctic. And you can repeatedly use it time and time again because of a lack of cooperation, a lack of standards, a lack of protocols, a lack of information sharing. So if we look at a number of strategy and policy areas that require assistance, you know, action has to be sort of coordinated and taken upon. And don't look to governments to try to solve this. Certainly the European Union, the United States, you know, are not going to take massive leadership roles in this. It's going to take all of us working together in our private industry, our national institutions, and also non-governmental organizations. The attacks, who's suffering of them? Everyone. But where's a tipping point where citizens demand more? Because in the end, that's what will drive change. Governments can make incremental responses. We're seeing that happening here in the EU with the NIS directive and the GDPR. We're seeing nations going ahead implementing laws, regulations, and policies to do this. But citizens at the end require our protection to make the internet a safe and secure place, because everyone benefits from a safe and secure cyberspace. How do these threats and challenges manifest themselves? Attacks in critical infrastructure. That's where citizens are going to say, no more, we need help. And in the developing world, these attacks may manifest themselves and have absolutely huge effects. The effects can not only hit national industries, government institutions, but places where there are weak and fragile institutions. If you'd have a high cyber attack or misinformation being received, as you can imagine, the effects that this may have on citizens in the developing world are pretty high. I'll give one example. There's plenty of mobile banking going on throughout the world in terms of individual mobile phone use and cell phone use. If there were some types of attack on the telecommunication systems and citizens could not get access to their small amounts of money on mobile pay devices, what type of repercussions, national security implications could this have for a nation? Pretty significant. In the developed world, we look at critical infrastructure as things. These are the 16 United States sectors. The EU has similar ones, 14, Japan, Korea. Many of the developing world, as they look through this, the NIST directive is tasking countries to identify critical information systems, critical information structures. But what I'd ask you to think about is not the things, but you. You are the critical infrastructure. Action doesn't happen without professionals, and it's a small number of technical experts, strategy, policy professionals, and leaders that are going to make the difference. So when we think of critical infrastructure, make no mistake, it's not things. It's people like you in the audience. And this is my call to action to say, help someone. And I'm going to talk to this about some of the solutions that we can take together to go ahead and solve some of these issues in the developing world. We're all busy. There's too many things to do at once. And Allison's talk of just a few minutes ago of what's happening in the Organization of American States is very relevant. Similar developmental and capacity building activities are happening all over the world. And CBAY's doing it, we're doing it at the Marshall Center. But with many things to do at once, you have to have strategies to think through it. And we talk about national cybersecurity strategies, that's the first step. That's the first step. I'm going to talk to you about some functional areas that need to be addressed as well. And here they are. These are 10 areas that we address in some of our capacity building work. They're not all of them. But the simple fact of cyber statecraft, how countries organize and think about changing the benefits of using a safe and secure cyberspace. Addressing those fundamental freedoms and rights, privacy and security. We can have both. We can have public-private partnership and information sharing. We need to talk about the important things of combating cybercrime and terrorist use of the internet. We have to do all these things. And unfortunately, they all require some type of national strategy. A strategy that includes government, includes business, and includes NGOs and private citizens and civil society. And this is hard work. We've seen how the developed world, not only Europe and America, but many, many other countries that are addressing these challenges, and how hard it is to get political consensus to inform, to educate. So, how do we do this? Again, it takes action by someone like you to volunteer to coach, train, and mentor, to say, I can contribute to this activity. And CBAY is doing some fantastic work in this. But it really requires comprehensive action by governments and action by private corporations to do this. Certainly civil society is involved as well. But strategy, policy, regulation, law, norms, best practices, it's all of those things, not just at a national strategy and you can say, we're done. That's just the first step. And think about the developing world with all the challenges that they have to just have good governance. A lack of corruption, to address crime, not just cybercrime, crime. These aspirational activities to do more in cyberspace just seem insurmountable, but they're not. And they're not because we can work together as a collaborative team and train, coach, mentor, and educate. And it doesn't require substantial sums of money. Certainly the United States and Germany are putting huge efforts into this. So is the European Union, so is Spain. But everyone can do a little bit more. And the effects of a little bit of help cascade into what I would call a tsunami of results. And we need to focus on that. And I'll get to that here in a second. So in Europe, we talked a little bit yesterday about the NIS directive. It requires member states to do national strategies, develop certs, and exercises at the EU level. Pretty small, but think about the challenges of putting the NIS directive action plan into legislation in all the EU member countries. Holy cow, that is a huge amount of work to do. And we're struggling not only in Spain, in Germany, in Poland, in many countries to address how are we going to put resources against this. I want you to think in the developing world, when they watch how long this has taken the EU to do, how would they go ahead and attack these challenges in their own country? Because they still have to have the same strategy, implementing law, policies, regulation. It's a huge amount of work. And when they look to the United States, they look to the developed world, they look to the EU, they're like, oh, this is massive amount of work. So they can learn from our mistakes, and they can also learn from where we do things well. And one of the things I'm really appreciative about in CBAE and the Spanish government does things very, very well. The collaboration with the OAS, internal to the nation, the cyber boot camp in the summer is part of that capacity building effort. And I would say, you want to spend money, spend it on that cyber boot camp and bring more young people to come, because the effects are huge. You change someone's life by bringing someone to an organization and to Lyon where they can meet many, many different contemporaries having the same challenges that they're doing. But if you think the NIS directive is a problem, holy cow, this is worse, the GDPR. So yesterday, Francisco ran a panel and he talked about one thing, data protection officers. How do you communicate the GDPR to partners that don't have laws, strategies, and policies in place to address any privacy issues? And we say, European data, you have to have all these things in place. I have to say it's a Brussels pipe dream to think that all of our partners are going to handle this. Certainly the developed world will figure it out. But how are we going to work? How is private industry, if you think you're going to be able to sit back and not do much with your private industry partners globally, no. You're going to have a training and education and compliance challenge to address all these issues in the GDPR. Going to be tough enough in Europe and the Western world. How are you going to do it with partners in Antarctica? How are you going to do it with partners in Africa, Central Asia, Asia Pacific Islands? Because where's that data going? Bad news, it's going everywhere. It's going everywhere. So, how do we work together to figure this out? We're going to make mistakes and we're going to be better in the long run, but in the near term, it's going to take a bunch of bright people, largely in private industry, to help us in this one. Bureaucrats made the rules. Who's suffering? Businesses. And they're our most important partners as we try to improve cyberspace. So the key takeaways, I'm going to lead you to this in a moment. You know, we need stability and development to happen at the same time, and that requires action by everyone. We may not get there through laws, policies, regulations, treaties, but we might be able to do things better through a norms-based approach. How does that norm-based approach manifest itself? Many academics and governments are looking at this. Some of it might be, for example, we will help countries protect, here's a good one. Countries will not attack the computer response teams of a nation. Sounds pretty simple, but getting countries to agree to that might be a challenge. Greater international cooperation certainly is necessary. I'll say something that's the real jewel of an activity like this and in CBay is the networking that's going on. This networking is excellent and should not be discounted for a real gift. I go to many conferences and, you know, you go to a conference and everyone to get in the doors, 300 euros, 500 euros, 1,000 euros to go to a door. This is excellent that the government has made a commitment to bring academics, private industry, government professionals together to help build their professional networks. I challenge you with your next step, invite a partner to come to this. Private industry individuals. If you've got someone working overseas, you've got subsidiaries maybe in other parts of the world, bring them to an event like this. Everyone will benefit. And as our role tries to manage risks, that's really what we have to do. Where are the priorities? How do you figure this out? Which areas do you start developing strategy in what priority order? This is the hard work of not only senior leaders to give guidance, but those practitioners like ourselves that have to think through how do we go ahead and start. And we can't do this without private industry really being leaders and following and being part of this process. So I'll say taking ownership is important. And how can we help the developing world? What are the things specifically that we can all do right now to jumpstart this process? So I've listed a few things. The key points are in green, but lack of national strategies. I mean, as Allison talked about this morning, you can see they had some countries that have developed one or two, and other countries requesting assistance. Get involved, volunteer to help. Your employees will benefit participating in those. They'll learn a lot. They'll meet a bunch of great people. Developing a culture of cybersecurity. We're at the first steps of this. Certainly, in CBay Cyber Bootcamp is one that I think is excellent. You know, people get along, they start building a culture, thinking about security first. We're seeing the first steps of that happening. Helping countries developing a CERT. Will those certs look like something that we have in the West? No, they certainly will not. But having a single point of contact in a nation to say, there's an incident and I know I can call someone. For most of the world, there's no place to call. Who do you call in case there's a problem? No one. You can do, maybe countries can do some diplomatic work, but this is something that would help create a more safe and secure cyberspace by starting with this. So for private industry, I'd say as you're out overseas, one of the things you want to encourage, this is number one. Who's your national point of contact, or do you have a computer emergency response team in place? Promoting modern laws to address cybercrime. Having, again, who do you call in case of a cybercrime? So we heard yesterday from the law enforcement officers, you know, them talking about their activities. Again, the West with the European Cybercrime Center, coordinating these activities within the EU is great, and globally with partners, like-minded partners. But in many countries, they don't have the education, the training, or laws in place to address cybercrime like we have in the West. So there are no roadmaps in developing culture of cybersecurity. This is a little bit of everything. It's education, it's training, it's conferences, webinars, networking, very important. One of the things that I think will be helpful, and we'll see more of, I'm sure of it, because the ability of governments to do all these things that I talked about is hard, with limited resources and the scope and scale of what has to be done in the developing world. We're going to rely more on private industry to do this, and to help, and to coach, lead, and mentor. And the systems that are in place in the West might not be how the systems look as the first steps in the developing world. And we just have to accept it, that it's going to be a hard walk, but we can do it together. We just need to start. And then finally, I think mainstreaming cyber issues is important. And how do we mainstream them? Persistence. Every time you get an opportunity to talk to business partners, talk to government colleagues, especially those outside of the cybersecurity area, we benefit from saying, what are you doing to bring this into your agenda? The EU's done a great job. So while data protection is not really cybersecurity related, or a foundational element of cybersecurity, it certainly is going to play a bigger role. And what we've designed within the GDPR is going to change over time for sure. So I'd say just mainstreaming the cybersecurity issues are important. But this is the biggest thing that we can do to go ahead and change the culture in mainstream. It's increasing trust. And you build trust by actually meeting people. So the networking, coming to conferences such as ANICE, getting out, meeting and connecting young people through education, through seminars. Building trust is the only way that we are going to jumpstart and accelerate improving cyberspace. It's the most foundational element, and you don't build trust at the end of a telephone call. You can't even start it until you meet someone. So I'd encourage you at the first coffee break, come and meet me if you want to learn more, because I'm always looking for partners to help us go do this development activities all over the world. The Marshall Center and certainly the EU capacity building efforts are always looking for partners to help in this, but you don't need our help to get you going. You can start on your own, because the change will only happen when we start with a little bit of trust, and trust requires action on your part. So with about 7 minutes left, I can answer some questions, and I want to thank you for your attention and realize that what you have here is great at NCBE. It's something that's very powerful, and one of the things that I think in the future, I wouldn't be surprised if you get more and more people wanting to come to such a quality event like this. So I want to thank the organizers and thank you for your attention these last few minutes.